my
parking
car meter. There we go. I'm gonna take it. There we go.
Is it paid?
Now I'm ready. I'm truly ready. Yes, paid.
Okay, good. Okay. I've had to pull paying out my parking meter in the most random, and it's always like a frantic thing where you're like, don't press the wrong button because you know you have like 25 seconds to pay it. Anyway, we're here with Shamil Idriss, who, just like us, it's one of those celebrity moments where you're like, look, they pump their gas. Look, they carry their groceries out. Shamil Idriss is a celebrity in my household, and I will now be introducing him to all of you, and you will see why he is celebrity level and also still has to worry about his parking. But I'm glad you got that taken care of. So Shamil, hi. Thank you and welcome to Twitch and the land of Anne. Do you know anything about Twitch?
Zero. Everything I learned about Twitch, I've learned in the last 5 minutes.
Which is that you don't know anything at all. Well, we at Land of End are very excited about the Twitch community because in our desperation to build community to the extent that we can, it feels like physically more challenging and more impossible to do that in our like more and more closed off. For me, it's a closet with all of the screens in front of me. This feels like the closest I can get to it. I love being able to hear from and talk to people in the chat. Please share your thoughts and your questions and your comments. This is a conversation that I need because spending time with peace builders like Shamil is a bit of a going to a church or a synagogue or a mosque, I imagine, where there's this like, okay, I have to continue to ask really tough questions of myself and the world around me, but maybe somebody has a GPS that we can take a little bit of comfort in. And Shamil, no pressure, but per usual, you're the guy.
All right. Let's do it.
Okay.
The Church of Land of Anne.
The Church of Land of Anne. Yeah, non-denominational. That's really important. But I'm a big fan of this Pope now, I think. Anyway, so Shamil is, for quick context, Shamil is one of the most respected voices in peace building worldwide. And I am going to ask you to define peace building at some point, Shamil, because I think that's a critical verb. There isn't and this is the bio that he hates when I read out loud, but there isn't a president, prime minister, secretary general, or any other respected or not so respected, like people who have power want to understand how Shamil understands power, who hasn't sought his advice. Nobody understands the nuance of transitioning from conflict to stability or peace better than Shamil and his team at Search for Common Ground. Search for Common Ground is an organization that is considered one of the largest peace building efforts worldwide. They work in approximately 33 different conflict zones in the world, and I challenge anybody to be able to list them off. For 30 years, Search has built and protected locally driven teams, and I know that being the most important, to help decrease tension, decrease conflict, and stabilize communities. And I do want to hear about what it is that you recently helped usher in, I can't remember the Stan.
Central Asia.
Thank you. Central Asia. Great. We'll just call it that until then. He and his team have contributed to many peace accords and armed treaties in the Middle East, pioneering development in the fields of citizen-led peace building, both in Nigeria and in working with Boko Haram and working with Meta and some of their efforts to decrease ethnic cleansing around the world. And most importantly, Shamil and his organization was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize by the Quakers. The Quakers, I am Quaker most of the time when I'm calm, cool, and collected. And he's, which is obviously not often. So Shamil, thank you so much. And thank you so much to your team. I know you're just the tip of the spear.
Yeah, no, the peace building spear. Sure. And look at you said we work with both Boko Haram and Meta. in one sentence. So that
Yes.
that
Well,
should
there
pique
are
people's
right. You know what, Shamil, also, if you say like Star Wars and gaming and video games and bro on Twitch, the algorithm funnels people here too. So we'll see what happens. All right. So Shamil, the big existential question. You have a lot of data and decades of experience of understanding conflict worldwide. There's probably some similarities, some familiar moments, cadences, temperatures, crossroads. Do you recognize any of those here in the United States? What are you particularly paying attention to? Are there those moments where you're like, oh, that happened over here in Sri Lanka, and I'm actually seeing that in Los Angeles? Would love to hear if you are observing any familiar patterns.
Yeah, no, so thanks for having me. And yeah, we look at so one of the things that's exciting in the whole field of peace building is we think we've started to figure out really what are the things that you really need to track so that you can know, ideally in advance, whether society is headed towards polarization and violent conflict or not. Um, in the healthcare field, there was a big leap made, when the shift came in medicine from treating sick people to preventing illness to begin with by fostering healthy lifestyles. That was a big shift. It elongated, people's lifespans. It led to different kinds of treatment that kept people out of the emergency room rather than just treating them once they stumbled in. And one of the key pillars of that shift in medicine was identifying what are the vital signs of a healthy human being, right? And there's enough consensus now globally that if you go to a doctor pretty much anywhere in the world, they're going to take the same 5 vital signs. They're going to take your temperature, ask if there's any pain, whatever, pulse rate, whatever they are. We did a lot of work over the last couple of years, working with peer leaders, policymakers, scholars, communities that we work with around the world to try to understand if we could figure out what's the equivalent of the 5 vital signs for a healthy society, right? And by a healthy society, I don't mean all good things in a society. If we wanted to list all the things that would make us happy to live wherever we live, it would be a lot more than 5 things. But what I mean is really
no parking meters.
There you go. That was top of the list, actually. But so when we look at what are the things that we can look at in the society to understand that when this society inevitably hits a speed bump, could be a pandemic, could be an earthquake, could be an act of violence, whatever it is, whatever crisis a society has. Is this a society that's likely to stick together, maybe even rally? Or is this a society that's likely to pull apart into polarization or even civil war, violent conflict? And so to answer your question about what we're seeing in the US and what we're seeing around the world, I'll quickly share the 5 vital signs of a healthy society with you. And we measure these things everywhere, from our team in Texas to our team in Afghanistan and Myanmar and everywhere in between. The first thing that we look at is levels of trust between communities. Black, white, Muslim, Jewish, Hutu, Tutsi, Sinhalese, Tamil, whatever it is. However society is divided up, we look at the levels of trust in between those communities. The second thing we look at is the levels of trust for institutions. Do people trust the police? Do they trust the healthcare system? Do they trust the judiciary? It doesn't just have to be government. It could be, do they trust the media? Do they trust Jenna's Twitch channel? So we look at institutional legitimacy. Do people trust those institutions that govern and serve them? The third is levels of physical violence, because violence begets more violence. So we look at how are things trending there. The fourth is really subjective. It's people's sense of agency. Do people feel like they can do anything to improve their lives, their children's future, their community's well-being? Do people have a sense of agency? Do they feel they can make any difference, or do they feel like it's just hopeless? And the fifth is resources. Where's the budget going? Is it going to more prisons, more guns, more top-down controls, the kinds of things that reflect that conflict has already gotten out of control? Or is it going to the kinds of things that prevent, violent conflict in the first place? Community problem solving, nonviolent conflict resolution efforts, that kind of thing. So we look at these 5 things everywhere: intercommunal trust, trust for institutions, levels of physical violence, people's sense of agency, and where resources are going. And over the last 10 years, we've seen significant declines in the United States on all of these measures. And we've seen troubling trends worldwide as well. And so, yeah, the quick answer to your question is that we're seeing a real decline in some of in the indicators that we look at to gauge whether a society is likely to hold together or pull apart.
Okay, so I feel like there's probably going to be departments at universities built around each one of these 5 pillars. And I appreciate that it's like 5 and that it's not like overly complex, but I do in some way, Shamil, feel like these 5 are like existential. If I think about the agency, and I obviously am saying this from a very specific life experience as a woman, as a mother, that when I look at, understand, study women in any one of the conflict zones that you're in, or just what it takes, what a caretaker is, like you exist in the hope that there's going to be something better for your child or the people that you love. And so like I'm trying to figure out what the agency is, what I want, what I hope for differently here in the United States. Like, sort of at the top of the list is no God. Like, every time I drop my kids off at school, every time every parent drops their kids off at school, it is like, I just hope they come home. And then there's, the 10 million other things too. But like, so when I think about agency, I have a hard time understanding what that means. The other thing that I'm questioning is this idea between like trust and systems. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because I think the concept of our systems are broken is something most folks don't really understand what that means. They get frustrated with like TSA. They know that speed limits are strong suggestions. They know that they're frustrated with taxes and, and the IRS is annoying, but they also want to be able to walk into an ER whenever they need to get stitches. So can you provide a little bit more around like this idea of agency, but also systems? Like one feels poetic in the whole purpose of being a human being, and one feels very like structural.
Yeah. Well, I think this notion of people's sense of agency is really interesting because it doesn't always correlate to what people think it will. People oftentimes think that wealthy people, for instance, feel a lot of agency and poor people don't. That does actually is not borne out. There are a lot of other factors that work into it. Whether people feel like they're part of a community where they're respected and listened to makes a huge difference, a tremendous difference. In fact, if I were looking at the number one important experience for somebody to have to become a constructive participant in their community, in their classroom, in their workplace, it's the experience of being heard and respected, especially by those who disagree with you. It's not the experience of being among a bunch of people who disagree with you. That experience of being heard and respected, what we've seen in very divided communities is that when people go through that experience of being heard and respected, let's say you say something on this call right now that really offends me, right? If my response to you is, look, Jenna, I totally disagree with you. I'm even honestly offended by what you just said, but I really genuinely want to understand where you're coming from. Have you had, personal experiences that make you feel that way? Where do you get your information from? Because I think it's different from where I get mine from. That response to you will open up an engagement with you that will make you feel respected, even though I just told you I disagree with everything you just said, right? This is just a simple kind of thing to think about. So that experience doesn't necessarily correlate to whether somebody's wealthy or not. When you look at the January 6th riots that we had on Capitol Hill, just a few miles from where I'm sitting right now, a few years ago, one of the interesting things about that demographic, it was a pretty upper middle class or middle class demographic. It was not a demographic of very poor people. And if you look at those 5 metrics that we look at, those people actually felt a whole lot of agency that day, right? They were taking things into their own hand. They were activating, but their sense of institutional legitimacy was in the gutter. They didn't think that the institutions that were supposed to represent them did. I'm not even getting into, do you agree with it? But the point is, you got to look at those 5 factors, and they don't always correlate to what people think they will. In fact, I'll tell you a quick story. A few years ago, there was the biggest study ever done on effective COVID response was reported in the Lancet. So the Lancet is like, I don't know, I think it's like a 300-year-old medical journal in
You're
the UK
dating
or something.
yourself,
It's very old.
Shamil.
Yes. Well, the thing that was interesting about this, I don't actually read the Lancet, but the findings were so shocking to the researchers that it made mainstream news, which is where I picked up on it. I think I read about it in the Washington Post. Anyway, this was a study that looked at 177 countries to understand which countries had the most effective response to the COVID pandemic. And they judged effectiveness by two metrics, infection rate and death rate. Okay. 177 countries. None of the things they thought would correlate to an effective response did. The strength of health infrastructure did not. The education levels in each country did not. The wealth or GDP, the productivity, the GDP per capita did not. Whether it was a democratic or an autocratic society did not. The things that correlated the most to an effective response was the levels of trust within communities and trust for institutions. And I would have thought generally that democratic systems would outperform undemocratic systems along these 5 vital signs that I shared with you, because at least a couple of them you would think democracies would agency. If you get a vote, I would think you'd feel more agency than somebody who doesn't get a vote.
Correct.
Right? Or institutional legitimacy. If you get to elect your leaders, I would think those institutions would have more legitimacy in your mind than somebody who doesn't. But what we've been seeing in the last 10 to 15 years, it's not just here in the United States, is that globally, democratic systems have not been outperforming undemocratic systems on these metrics. And so are not more resilient.
Suggestion, by the way.
Right. No, I'm not saying I don't want to live in a democratic society, but I think all of us who want to protect democratic systems and shore them up need to tackle not just protect the institutions, but we have to tackle why it is that people feel that those systems are not sufficiently representing them and delivering for them. And that's a real challenge that we have. So on your agency point, that I just wanted to share a little bit about it. Things that feed into agency are things like people feeling heard and respected, people feeling like the institutions that govern them actually care about them, and they're trying, even if they're failing, that there's an effort underway. Those kinds of things are really quite critical. On your, so that was you asked about agency. On the trust
Can I pause and just just respond to that a little bit?
Yeah.
So, on the agency bit, when I hear you say agency, what I actually think I hear you say is dignity. That I want to see and be seen. I want to feel like I am part of a thing that's bigger. I want to feel like my concerns, my vulnerability are protected, and the relationships I might have with my stories and the ones that I want to teach my children are also have a safe space. But agency in the United States today has felt like I think it's morphed from that. I think it's morphed into I need you to know that I'm right. It's not about just let me celebrate Christmas versus Hanukkah. Let me keep my vote private. It feels like it's become binary, win-loss. We've added different currencies to that agency that are beyond that human desire to just be heard and be respected.
Yeah. Well, look, so the first 2 vital signs we talked about are trust between communities and trust for institutions. When you're looking at these trust metrics, right, it becomes really important for people that they feel that sense of dignity, that they feel that across dividing lines in their societies, across racial, religious, political dividing lines, and they feel that the institutions that govern and serve them have their interests at heart to some extent. So that's where that agency is really a question of do you feel like you can make any difference? And do you do anything about it? Jenna, you've always struck me as somebody who has a very strong sense of agency. Just the fact that you've started this channel, that and it's not a channel to just talk about whatever. It's to talk about things that matter to people, things that are important to the future of people's lives and livelihoods and the politics and et cetera, et cetera. So agency is really about I think of it more as, do you feel like you can make any difference, and do you try, or have you given up all hope and you feel like it doesn't really matter what I do because it's not going to make any difference. And I think one of the things you talked about, the role of women, and you talked about the role of mothers. The other demographic I think about a lot in this area is young people, right? Stereotypically young people, and traditionally young people, one of the reasons they're such powerful forces for change is that young people tend to have a strong sense of agency. Of they want to do, they want to do things. They don't automatically accept the dividing lines that their older generations pass down to them, and they say, I don't really care if you think that I shouldn't date somebody from that race or that ethnic group or whatever. I'm gonna love who I love, or they're gonna, whatever it is. Like young people have a lot of that. And one of the things that's distressing to me right now in here in the United States, for example, is that you're seeing really very low levels among young people of that belief that democratic systems are work. And I kind of understand where that's coming from. If you look at the last 20 years that they've grown up in, that generation has grown up in. But the bottom line of all this to me, Jenna, is if we want to keep our societies from descending into a spiral of polarization and violence, there really isn't a substitute for trying to build or rebuild trust across our dividing lines and for the institutions that govern and serve us. And there's no kind of shortcut to that. That we have to get to that work. And that's one of the most important, that was the finding of that, I didn't finish off that finding on that COVID study. None of those other things correlated. The thing that correlated was levels of trust between communities and trust for institutions. So if you look at like the top 20 countries in terms of effective COVID response from that study, I think the number one country was Vietnam, but the top 20 were all over the map on wealth and democratic versus autocratic, strength of the education systems, et cetera, et cetera. But they all had somehow maintained high levels of trust. And that oftentimes has as much to do with our culture and our social norms as it has to do with our political leadership and our political institutions.
Yeah, it does feel like when I have heard you tell this story before, and I do think that like because it became so weaponized, became so political, even in the state of like, I don't know, like just the being in the I don't know-ness, which is just another way of saying like I'm in the land of and-ness, that it was an automatic trigger within our society now to be like, the other, you got a different perspective, you're not on my team, we don't have the same perspectives, whatever it might be. And then it turned into the, can I trust my neighbor? Can I trust this person? And it turned into this, not a trust war, but it forced me to have to reckon with whether or not I can trust myself in my own intuition in interpreting a system, a news outlet, a person, whatever it might be. Like we've even, I feel like, lost the ability to trust ourselves in this.
Well, it's interesting. We got some funding during COVID to look in 11 countries that were very affected by conflict to try to understand and help them in their response to conflict dynamics and to deal with COVID amidst conflict dynamics. Anyway, we were looking at one of the things that we looked at was why were people spreading misinformation about COVID. And one of the things that we found is that oftentimes people were spreading this stuff, didn't necessarily believe it, but they hated this government that was saying this thing, so they were going to say that thing. It was very tribal. And to your point, we see a lot of that too, where it's not even, sometimes it's about what to trust and what not to trust. And someone's like, I don't really, at a certain level, people kind of lose a little bit whether they care about what's true or not, and just say, this is my team. This is the team I'm against. And whatever my team says or does, I'm with them.
Right. I'm from Philly. I'm a Philly girl. Like, I get it. We have liquor stores on Roosevelt Island, on Roosevelt Boulevard that are just called Dallas Sucks. And when people come up to Philly and they're like, why do you hate Dallas so much? I'm like, I don't know. We just do. Like, that's just the deal in 215. But like, is that must be a pattern, a millennia-old pattern, this othering.
I mean, I don't know. It's a good question, a good point. I don't know how much this breaks off around. I'm curious what some of the folks who are following this would say about the generational size of this. I think that our information ecosystem, our social media platforms, and now we'll see the impact of AI, but certainly those social media platforms have really not helped us on this score. They have really funneled us into communities of the like-minded. where, theoretically we now have access to more sources of information than ever before in human history. But practically, we know that we tend to subscribe to the sources that reinforce what we already believe. And when you do that, part of what happens is you not only get, even more convinced in your own views, you actually become more extreme and more rigid. And so that lack of interaction, lack of engagement across differences becomes really a problem. I mean, one of the things that's hard, Jenna, to go back to that medical analogy of the 5 vital signs of a healthy human being, and we look at these 5 vital signs of a healthy society. The first vital sign I shared with you is trust between communities, right? Black, white, Republican, Democrat, whatever, however you want to divide up society, your community. And one of the things that we've seen globally, not just in the United States, is a really rapid increase in polarization, right? And polarization, the definition of polarization is increasingly accepted definition in my world is when one side sees the other side as an existential threat. Right, because sometimes people say, well, isn't polarization sometimes good? Like before an election, you polarize so people understand the choices or whatever. But when you understand polarization as, I see you as an existential threat, there's no positive to that. That's the precursor to dehumanization and violence and all that, right? And so what we've been seeing over the last 2 decades is a real increase in polarization. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace did a study going all the way back to 1900. I don't know what metrics they use, but they basically, and it's very clear, this came out just less than 2 years ago, that every region of the world, with the exception of Europe during World War II, is at the highest levels of polarization since 1900, since they started collecting that data. And over the last 15 years, every region of the world is experiencing a faster increase in polarization than they ever have at any other time in history, other than Europe leading into World War II. So this polarization dilemma, when I think of the analogy to the vital signs of a healthy human being, I think of polarization really like a fever, right? Because sometimes, like you need to take it really seriously, but you don't want to get overly focused on polarization alone. But what I mean by that is if you go to a doctor with a really bad fever, like they're going to work really hard to get the fever down because the fever alone can kill you, right? It can basically cook your organs, right? But if all they do is bring your fever down and then kick you out of the hospital and say, see you later, there's a very good chance that you're going to get very sick because something drove that fever, something caused that fever, right? So polarization is a lot like that, where when we get to a certain level of polarization, we can't work together on anything. We can barely name a post office collaboratively because we're so divided over things. But if all we focus on is, we have to build bridges across difference, we have to connect people with one another, that alone, the connection is important, but we've got to figure out a way to get people not just talking, but actually collaborating, doing things together that actually advance each of their own interests or address their concerns. Because that's really where you start seeing some of those other vital signs move in a really positive direction. People feeling more agency. There's like nothing builds trust like shared success, right? And getting people, even if it's something silly, like you and I disagree on 20 things, but we both agree, I don't know, that the street lamps on our kids' walk to school should be. Well, let's not go there. You're going to really make things. You're going to test my peacebuilding skills.
I'm playing with the algorithm. Boko Haram. Right. We probably agree on that. But keep going on.
Yeah. So anyway, so we need to tackle polarization, but we can't get overly focused on, well, let's just have more dialogue to deal with polarization. Because after a while, if dialogue doesn't lead to change that's meaningful to people, dialogue itself will become a dirty word. People feel like, why am I still talking to these people when my community is continuing to be harmed?
Right. Yeah. Shamil, there's a great question in the chat around like, what is the way to find the common ground? I mean, I know it's like, I'm not here to do a marketing campaign for Search for Common Ground, but like it is that shared humanity or the lights on the street or the potholes, or, there isn't anyone I know that doesn't want teachers or nurses to be paid more. Like there are all of these things that do feel like we agree on. And going back to how you were describing the folks who participated in January 6th, most of them came from Bucks County, Pennsylvania, a 3.5 mile, as the crow flies from where I'm sitting. They all came from this one very specific gym, and they're all very comfortable. Like they're all very financially comfortable. They won for nothing. And the truth is even though, you know, I don't want to necessarily split the hair on how I feel about what happened that day and the long-term generational consequences of it. But I bet if we went 20 for 20 on items, we would be 19 out of 20 in terms of the things that we agree on. How do you quickly catapult with folks? And being in Twitch is not a space where somebody like me ever shows up. I mean, there's a very specific demographic of people who come on here to do very specific kinds of things. How do we catapult conversations with people who we think are the other? And when you describe it as folks believing that the other is an existential threat to their existence, I feel that so deeply. The way you phrase it, there are so many times when I'm like, yep, that is absolutely true.
Yeah. Well, a couple things. One is on both sides of that equation, we would never push or force somebody who feels like they're under serious threat to, oh, no, you really got to understand the other side. No, you really got to go talk to them. I mean, that's a way of kind of re-victimize people and kind of traumatizing people, frankly. So I don't want to make it sound like this is just, hey, everybody needs to just, you need to know first and foremost, where are you at? What do you need? Maybe all you need right now is actually some time with people who are going to care about you and know what you're going through, are going to make you feel heard and listened to, literally, and you need some time. So that's fine. Like, I think we each need to know where we are. I think if and when people are ready to reach across any of those dividing lines, whether they're political or, again, racial, ethnic, religious, whatever they might be, one of the key things is asking questions with real curiosity. Like, I mean, there are things you can do as a facilitator if it's like if you're actually bringing a group together. One of the standard things that done in different settings is, let's say that we had 5 of us sitting around or 10 of us sitting around a table or whatever. You don't jump right into, so let's talk about, the Eagles and the Cowboys, or let's talk about Israel Palestine. You don't go straight to like the hardest things. You start with things like, there are a lot of tools you can use. Like, for instance, we'll say, hey, everybody, we're going to do a little icebreaker. I want everybody here to think about 3 elements of your identity that are meaningful to you. They could be anything. They could be the fact that you're one of 6 children. You're the oldest of 6 children. They could be the fact that you're an Orthodox Jew. They could be the fact that you're an avid, long distance runner. Like, just 3 aspects of your identity that are meaningful to you. And now I want you to choose one of them that you're going to spend 2 minutes expanding on. And that's how we're going to get to know one another. So we're going to go around, and every person's going to list the 3 you started with, but then spend 2 minutes talking about the one that you want to talk about today. By the time you get to the end of everybody introducing themselves in that way, what has happened is that you've established all kinds of crisscrossing overlaps that you never could have anticipated before the conversation started. We used to do this on virtual dialogues in platforms between teenagers in the US and teenagers in Muslim majority countries. And I'll never forget one example where, like, there was a kid in Texas, and there was a girl she was in rural Egypt, right? And the thing that they really clicked over was that both of their parents were putting serious pressure on them to get married young. They were from both really religious communities and families, different religions, Christian and Muslim. But that was something that came out in the introductory. So the first thing to talk about here is, like, you don't jump straight into the issues, and you don't make the issue more important than the person. You just got to get to know one another. And oftentimes, like, one of the things with trust is that you can only build it incrementally, but you can destroy it really fast. With one insult, one betrayal, certainly one act of violence. And so the trust building process, but it isn't magic. It is basic. Ask questions that people want to get into. Look for those overlaps that connect. Talk about what's important to people. Talk about something meaningful to them. How do they enjoy? How are they getting through a really difficult, intense year? Like, what are the things that enable people to get to know one another before, like, just hammering right out, there's an issue that I want to talk about, and here we go. So I think, and that, I'll give one example that's very concrete. You mentioned at the outset that we contributed to a wonderful peacebuilding breakthrough recently. About 2 months ago, the presidents of Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan in Central Asia, they shook hands and they ended what was until then a 101-year-old border dispute that had left more than 100,000 people displaced and would flare up every few years and leave dozens, sometimes more than 100 people killed at a time. our colleagues in Central Asia, in Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, had been working for 7 years behind the scenes and bringing together people close to the presidents on the, providing policy papers to try to, help with the negotiations. Anyway, one of my colleagues who was central to that effort, he really built up our program in Kyrgyzstan, and he was struggling a lot when he started it to try to get the police and the religious community to meet with one another. Particularly the Muslim community, the Muftiyat, which is the kind of the highest ranking the religious leaders, the organization of religious leaders in the country. Anyway, this is a post-Soviet society, so religion and society, they're figuring things out, how that's going to work. And there were threats of violent extremism that were coming from members of the Muslim community, and the police and the security forces felt like that community wasn't being sufficiently forthcoming and helpful. While people in the Muslim community were furious that the police kept doing things like infiltrating the mosques, arresting imams without any warrant, and basically were sowing distrust, when a lot of the Muslim leaders felt like this is a problem for us too. Most of these extremist groups are all outside groups that are recruiting away our young people, trying to appeal to their dissatisfaction, and you're not helping. You're actually making things worse. You're making young people feel more targeted, and you're making our lives more difficult. Anyway, so Kanesh, my colleague, was trying to get them to work together, and he couldn't. They had horrible relationship, and he couldn't. So he came up with the idea of basically appointing them both, the police chief of Bishkek, the capital of Kyrgyzstan, and the Grand Mufti, the highest-ranking religious official, Muslim religious official. He appointed them both to the advisory board to advise him and us on what we should do in their country, which they did. And it was a place of honor for them, and they contributed to. Anyway, I flew into Bishkek for the first time. I'd never visited there before, and Kanesh organized like an advisory board dinner with me for the first night. And I happened to find myself sitting across from the police chief and next to the deputy grand mufti, and we're talking, and very organically, they start talking about the fact that, we didn't know each other before this. Actually, we didn't like each other before this experience. So, we've gotten to know one another. And then completely organically, they talked about how they uncovered some of these tensions and what was driving some of these tensions, and came up with some really creative ideas. The police chief was really proud of an idea that he came up with the Grand Mufti, that during the holy month of Ramadan in Islam, where Muslims fast for a full month, and every night they break the fast at the sundown, at a meal called iftar. The iftar meal is the breakfast meal. That he would go every single night of that month. He would go to a different Muslim community to join them for the iftar meal. And that now had developed years later into something called iftar drives that the police broadly would do to build those relationships with the Muslim community. He was really proud of it. And the whole time that they're telling me the story, I'm looking at Kanesh at the end of the table because I knew this was what he had in mind the whole time. He didn't know how it would work out, but he knew that if these people could see each other, if they could sit on the same side of the table facing a common problem, which is how to advise us, rather than sitting across the table seeing each other as the problem, then you could maybe do. And so, the quick answer to your question is you don't jump straight into the issues. You enable people to get to know one another. You ask a lot of questions. You let people bond and find all of these overlapping ways in which we actually do relate really well with one another before you start exploring some of the issues and the tensions that underline and block us from solving some of our bigger problems.
Well, here on the land of Anne, my hypothesis is that one of the common grounds is like our collective curiosity, that I'm confused, I'm curious, I'm confused, I'm curious, like tell me more, the tell me mores of it all. And I know that food obviously is one of those common grounds. Would you mind sharing the story that I love about Iran and the wrestling team, the American wrestling team?
Yeah. So in 2015, the Iran nuclear accord was signed, and Secretary of State Kerry, U.S. Secretary of State Kerry, and the Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif at the time, they publicly thanked our organization for providing some breakthrough ideas to the nuclear accord. But what people weren't so aware of is that work had started decades earlier, when we organized the first public visit of Americans to Iran since the Iranian Revolution, when the American hostages were taken in the embassy. The embassy was taken over, and there were these 400 hostages were taken for 400 and whatever days. And there had been no official relations since then. So we met an Iranian former ambassador who expressed an interest in trying to figure out a way to melt the ice between the two countries. and we identified an American former ambassador, in fact, a guy who had been named ambassador to Iran by Jimmy Carter, and then right before he was supposed to go, the embassy was taken over, and he never got to go. But he knew Iran very well. He had studied Iranian poetry. He had been there as a Peace Corps volunteer. His name was Bill Miller. He passed since then. Anyway, we got these two former diplomats together to brainstorm what is a way that we could do something between these two countries that would break the ice, but in a totally non-political way, in a way that could capture popular attention. It would have to be because there were real power dynamics there, that there was a lot of insecurity among the Iranians, that the Americans were so much more powerful than them. So it had to be a field of engagement where the Iranians felt they were equally, if not a little bit more powerful. Anyway, they came up with wrestling, of all things. Wrestling is huge in Iran. It's like it may be bigger than any sport is in the U.S. It's not just a popular sport. There's mythology around great wrestlers. There's storytelling, and it's really well known. So we sent the Olympic wrestling team to Iran in 1999, the U.S. Olympic wrestling team to Iran to compete in something called the Takti Cup. It's this big annual wrestling tournament. Anyway, and there were plans around this which we followed through. Like when the American wrestlers came back, Bill Clinton had them into the Oval Office. This was a signal that this apolitical event was also hopefully an opening to something. And I got to meet the heavyweight American wrestler upon their return, who told me, I'll never forget the story. He said, we landed in Tehran at 2 a.m, or it was after 2 a.m. when the plane landed in Tehran. And he said there were a couple hundred Iranians like at the airport. And they were chanting my name. He was like, they knew my name. And he was like, I'm the American gold medal winner. Americans don't know my name. I won the gold medal for the U.S. and Americans have no clue who I am. But I show up here and like all these Iranians are cheering for me and stuff. He thought it was so cool. Anyway, that led to, there's nothing more irrelevant than wrestling. I was the captain of my wrestling team in high school, so I can say this is not meant to be an insult to wrestlers. But like when you're thinking about geopolitics, it's like, what does that have to do with anything? But that one engagement broke the ice. And after that, for literally decades, we would organize meetings. We would do some cultural things, exchanges of filmmakers. Iranian film and cinema is also really respected. Always looking for fields of engagement where the Iranians could engage at an equal level or even at a better level than the Americans could, because the power issue was always there. And at times, when the political climate allowed it, bringing together people close to decision makers to explore whether what could, and so eventually, once there was political will in both D.C. and Tehran under Obama for the negotiations, we were able to have some small contribution that was recognized by the officials. But it all went back kind of to the question of like, how do you start? It all went back to something, and it almost always does. The more divided societies are, the more violence they have experienced, the more there's a thirst for vengeance, the more that there's anger.
Yeah.
You really have to start somewhere that just gets people seeing each other as human again, or for the first time, and build from there.
Yeah, I'm a little intimidated by that because, gosh, every time I listen to you, Shamil, I just have so many thoughts. A quick room reset. We're here with Shamil, who is the CEO of Search for Common Ground, a many decades old organization that's probably at the epicenter of some of the most important peace building, peace creating, peace protecting efforts worldwide, including preventing genocide in Burundi, working from East Timor now to rural Pennsylvania. And we are just so grateful that there are actually people who know what they're talking about in these moments. And Shamil is one of them. And as I said at the top of the conversation, being across from you, even though virtually, often makes me get more confused, which is 43 years. Thanks for the correction. Makes me, it's like, it just pushes me to think harder about the state that we're in today in the US. And so there's one thing that you said last week when we spoke. You said one of the elements of trust that is a metric of yours or something that you observe that I've thought about a lot since you shared this is that if there is a disaster, natural disaster in particular, do neighbors who have thought of each other as existential threats, who have like bought into the polarized ideas, do they come to each other's aid? I am of the belief that still here in the United States, the answer to that is yes. I am surrounded by a lot of activist friends and Black women I have heard who have said long before anything that's happening, on today on this page in our history books who have said that's absolutely not true for them, that they don't believe that even in a post-natural disaster state that their neighbors would come and support them. So I want to get your take on is if that is the moment, if that's like the scraping of the bottom of the barrel, am I breaking my bread to share it with you in crisis? Do you think we are here yet? Are we there yet in the US? And then my question, going back to being part of the solution, both diagnosing it and then being part of the solution, that sort of CDC analysis that you gave about not just treating symptoms, but preventing them. I don't know if I could tell you what like that common ground thing is here in the US outside of fear. You know, even here, and I'd be curious to hear from Master Liberty, who I know is lurking, but like, what is the common ground? You've spent a lot of time in our Twitch channel, but like, and like, what is the common ground that you see between us now? But this idea of like, what is the thing that we can all share outside of, I don't know, we wish traffic was better on 95. We wish we didn't have to pay higher taxes. Some of us want religion in the classroom, some of us don't. Like what is that thing? And I know you don't have the answer. I know you don't know whether or not it's iftar drives or wrestling, but I know your team is orbiting it. Love for freedom. And actually, Shamil, I'm gonna pause you real quick, only because Master Liberty, who is someone who has spent time in our community a lot, and we don't always see eye to eye, but he just shared that maybe that common ground variable for us is the idea of freedom. But I don't know if that also means agency, to your earlier point.
No, it's great. I mean, it's interesting. There's a saying in the humanitarian sector that you shouldn't exchange business cards in a hurricane. Which is basically saying, you don't wait for all things to go crazy to establish the relationships that you need to protect one another and help one another.
Yeah.
Having said that, as you were just pointing out, sometimes you do need a breakdown to have a breakthrough, and sometimes it's only when things go really bad that people actually reach out to one another. But I think the answer to your question, and Master Liberty might be on something, is that from my perspective, this is where asking questions and going local is really critical. People fast track past the local to the national because they feel like, well, we have to work at this bigger scale. The local is just too disconnected from the big changes. But when a society is this polarized, so many things that get launched at the federal level get immediately sucked into the vortex of polarization. I mean, so many things now that you would think are universal, depending on who's talking about them, are immediately associated with one or the other side of the political divide in this country. Right. And so that doesn't mean we shouldn't do anything at the national level, but I feel like we should be doing so much more at the local level, where we're identifying what are those issues in Tulsa, what are those issues here in Washington, D.C., what are the issues in Los Angeles right now, what are the issues anywhere that actually where community members feel like, in the early stages of this republic, there was this French social scientist, Alexis de Tocqueville, who famously, visited the country and commented on how amazing he found, this experiment in democracy. And the thing that he really highlighted that he thought was the magic of this country wasn't so much the system of government. It wasn't so much the institutions of government and the checks and balances. I mean, not that he ignored that, but that what he thought was really extraordinary was what he called civil society. The way in which he found that Americans would come together across their differences in this association over here, and then a different group of Americans would come together on that issue over here, and then they would form. There was agency, and that agency was issue specific, not identity based strictly, right? And I think what to me is the most important thing to revitalize in this country if it's going to not only survive but thrive and get past this period of polarization to a higher place for everybody is to reinvigorate that kind of collaborative action at those local levels, that culture of collaboration. And so the answer to your question for me is going to be different in each society, in each community, and that's okay. And we should build up from there. Having said that, there's a brilliant polling outfit called More in Common, which you can tell from their name. What they do in the United States and in other democratic societies is they're polling constantly to look at exactly your question. Where is there maybe hidden common ground that might even be like the iceberg, where on the tip of the iceberg, all you see is rancor and disagreement, but actually there's a massive common ground on these 10 issues. So, contrary to what I'm saying, More in Common has identified a number of areas where even at the national level, there seems like there could be a lot of space for, commonality and collaboration. But to me, this stuff isn't so interesting when it's theoretical. It's like, you know what, you and I live in the same community, or we're part of the same social media group, or we're whatever, and we have a concern or we have an interest. And, we disagree on a lot of things, but we can agree on those, and we're going to do something about it together because you're important to me.
Yeah. Yeah. I see Master Liberty's comment. I do have this like long term, and I also see Ukraine aid. We'll definitely get his take on Ukraine, Russia. But I want to go back to something that you said about young people that gives me a little bit of pause and concern. And also like this idea of like local solutions coming together around everything is so nationalized. I spend, Jeremy and I, for those of you who don't know, my husband and I, we spend a lot of time outside of Philadelphia in New York City and then on the other coast or just traveling around the country. And like, I know I can get my prescriptions at every CVS. I know what, cereal I'm going to grab for the kids at Trader Joe's. Like there isn't a lot of like uniqueness in each of those individual spaces, recognizing that there's obviously very specific characteristics to each zip code. But it feels like there is this like hyper Americanized vibe everywhere, and that everything is owned by a big top down entity. So I think of like Home Depot. I spent a lot of time talking about in the book that I wrote about how everyone was really obsessed with their right to a close parking spot in Home Depot, or like this idea of road rage. And I have sat in cars with people over the years, and I felt like there's been this like road rage rise, which I feel like is a reflection of our entitlement around like, let me go first, or that parking spot should be closer to me, or like I insist on, how is it my elementary school teachers and perfectly educating, socializing, raising my kids? How did my doctor miss this one diagnosis? That there's this sense of like, you owe me-ness. And I think it's uniquely American. And then my fear in that entitlement transferred to like young folks who are going to have an increasingly more challenging time finding jobs is that there's going to be this like pop-off moment, if frankly, Shamil, it's not already happening. But I would love to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on like what is different though about the American polarization. Nealon referenced this, that Americans haven't experienced war. We're not sort of literate in those kinds of crises. But I think there's a connect to the entitlement, but also like I'm trying to thread the needle that like I think young people, it scares me more than it has in previous generations when I've always felt like young people are on the right side of history.
Yeah, I mean, they're in the United States. I guess I grew up in the U.S., the son of immigrants, and I had one of the things I've always appreciated about the U.S. and that I've also recognized as sometimes a double-edged sword is the very inherently American can-do attitude. Like this notion of agency is very strong oftentimes in the United States. You can argue with whether how is it just a myth or not, or is it only true for certain demographics in this country and not. We can get into all of that stuff, but this notion that you can be what you want to. I mean, if you look at what has driven so much immigration to this country, including my parents, it was this notion that if you worked hard enough, you could make something of your life here that was different from what you might be able to do elsewhere. When Klaus Schwab started the World Economic Forum, the whole idea of that was to try to bring some of that entrepreneurial spirit from the U.S. business community in more conversation with the European business community. Not like there wasn't entrepreneurialism there, but have you ever heard him talking about why did he start that decades ago? It was to try to get some of that like entrepreneurial can-do attitude. Now, that can-do attitude can also have a really dark side about, you can create a democracy over here by unseating Saddam Hussein and rather quickly. And there's a lot of unrealistic and sometimes quite damaging, consequences of that kind of can-doism. But there's real strengths in that. And going back to this notion of civil society being a really important part of things, there's nothing that undergirds the emergence and a vibrant civil society than a strong sense of we can make change if we work hard enough for it, and we have some agency. Even if we're up against big odds, we can do things. And I think it's the more distressing to me is when people give up that hope, when they feel like, it doesn't matter, just doesn't matter. And I think one of the things that we're seeing, you titled this Authoritarianism and Anarchy. These are two trends that we're seeing globally that people will oftentimes argue are opposed to one another. In some ways they are, but they really fuel one another as well. The more, and you see this, I'm talking in gross generalities, obviously, right now, but like you see this in the US right now, where on the political left, there's a lot of concern about authoritarianism and the concentration of power, in the White House. On the right, you see a lot of this. Well, there's so much disorder and it's really anarchy. And without getting into like the fact of the matter is that both of those, and they fuel one another. The more that one side hypes up one of those, the more you see, the more you see a response to a concern about authoritarianism, say, well, then we're not going to abide by those laws, or what, we're going to firebomb Teslas as a way of expressing our opposition to this government, or what, we'll assassinate a healthcare executive in New York, and a lot more people than you would hope will kind of celebrate or shrug their shoulders and go, well, what, that's the price of a healthcare system that's unjust. Like, that is clearly, these are not just ways of responding to a fear about authoritarianism. And then on the flip side, you see people painting popular demonstrations almost immediately as hugely violent, when oftentimes, if there is violence, it's a tiny percentage. So what I found about these dueling trends that actually fuel one another of anarchy and authoritarianism is that they both are sustained by the same soil, which is collapsing trust. Which is, as people lose trust in the institutions that govern and serve them, they either say, you know what, burn it all down, or elect a strong man to deliver us. And so we are, at my organization, and the activists that I'm engaged with globally are less focused on, it's not that we don't see the dangers of authoritarianism on the one hand or anarchy on the other, but what we're really focused on is rebuilding trust between communities and the institutions that govern and serve them, because we see that as the place that can actually create a better future for everybody and not get sucked into that back and forth between those polar, perspectives.
Okay. In our last couple of minutes, I am going to ask you to give a couple of examples, because I am feeling a little hopeless. I'm feeling confused. I mean, thinking that anarchy and authoritarianism are grown from the same soil feels like, oh, well, that all makes sense. I watch that with my kids. I watch that with, there's so much that feels human about this, but at just such a large scale. And I'm so afraid of what's to come, and our inability to flex our humility and being like, I don't know what I don't know. Or I just care about you as a human, even if you and I have dramatically different perspectives on our relationship with the Constitution, like Master Liberty and I do. But I would love to hear some examples, and I am going to ask you to identify some pretty extreme examples, something that is very foreign to us as Americans. Nealon, one of Shamil's colleagues who is focused on what's happening in the United States, Search for Common Ground has not had offices in the US until about 6 years ago, 7 years ago, 8 years ago, something like that. You've been internationally focused, but said that, one of the things that's different about Americans and other places around the world is a lot of Americans don't actually know what war is like. And that felt like we don't know where we don't really understand the dangers of all of this to understand how important it is to avoid it. I would love to hear from you when you talk about like trust building, because that feels so like fluffy and nice and lovely. And it is what I'm trying to do here on Land of And, is like just be confused publicly, even though I have very strong moral perspectives or where my moral line is. Can you help us understand like what trust building looked like in post-genocide Rwanda, or in preventing genocide in Burundi, or some of the work that you did in East Timor, or encouraging
So
folks to
let me.
be vulnerable in Sri Lanka.
I I will. Let me do this if I could, Jenna, because I'm thinking is. Do you think most of your audience is today is American? I know it's a global audience.
I know that there's you very interesting Ukrainians here. I would assume, yeah.
Well, because what I'm thinking of, so one of the things that's interesting right now over the last few years is it's really for the first time in my experience, I've been seeing more and more American activists um, actually wanting to hear and learn from people overseas. I don't mean to make that sound so condescending, but there is a strong
You
strand
can.
of
We're
exceptionalism in
obnoxious.
the
Yes.
U.S. And but in a very practical way, for the reason that you just shared, in fact, our U.S. team, among the other many things that they do, we work in Pennsylvania and Texas um, on an effort that's intended to make the states more resilient, and we work with partner organizations who have the lead in many other states. So, but in Pennsylvania and Texas, we have the lead, and so we built this coalition across racial, religious, and political lines in both Pennsylvania and Texas of activists and community leaders and people of different standings, all in the lead up to the elections last year, which people were very worried could turn violent. And so the organizing principle for them is what could they do to prevent political violence in their states, right? So we're doing work, for some time, building those relationships in that careful way, asking questions, bringing people together around common interests, whatever. And then there was the assassination attempt against then candidate Trump in Western Pennsylvania, the Butler Fairgrounds. And the community there mobilized immediately across their dividing lines in some very concrete ways. And I'm telling this American story to get to your international point because I want to make a point at the end about this, about how this all happened. So they did some very immediate and practical things. First, the assassination attempt that killed a fireman in the audience happened on a Saturday. By Sunday morning, the Christian leaders across that region in Western Pennsylvania had talking points that this coalition had pulled together, which they didn't have to use. They could toss if they wanted them, but they were talking points on what are some ways you could talk about this with your congregations on Sunday morning to help calm tensions, make people feel heard, and keep people together and prevent any, kind of follow-on violence or whatever. They mobilized an interfaith coalition to go to the fairgrounds physically and literally reconsecrate the grounds for the purpose that those grounds were originally established for, which was to be a safe communal gathering place. They got a MAGA endorsed state representative to go on Truth Social, the Trump social network,
Yeah.
and push back against the scapegoating of the Haitian community in Charleroi. And they got these two talking heads who have a TV show, one of those like crossfire kind of talk shows in Pennsylvania. For the first time, they changed the format of their show to be a dialogue, not a debate, over the issue of how to prevent more political violence in the state. And then they went on a tour. They did a talking tour and say, this is all off of one event. All of these things got mobilized very quickly. The reason I go into that is because a lot of that work, the seeds of that were sowed when those activists in Pennsylvania and the other activists in Texas with whom we work met with our Sri Lanka director. Now, our Sri Lanka director, Nawaz Muhammad, is an extraordinary peace builder and leads an unbelievable team that's been working there for a couple of decades. And they've been credited with doing phenomenal work to reconcile Sri Lanka's society after the civil war there and to prevent violence, as well as many other really exceptional and
We're going to
historic
have
advances
Nawaz
that
on
they've taken.
soon.
He's amazing. What was really interesting, though, is that the Texans and the Pennsylvanians engaged in that conversation. They were rapt. I wasn't there, but a lot of people told me like they were so into it. It wasn't theory. It was practical. Like, how do you prepare for an election that could turn violent? What are different scenarios? What are things that you can put in place? What are the ways in which you can mobilize? How can you react if somebody shows up with a gun at a polling center? Like all this stuff, right? It was very, very practical. And so we are seeing an openness from Americans who increasingly want to learn from other societies that have successfully walked back from the brink of violence or recovered from violence, from mass violence. I think there is a lot of hunger for this. Even short of violence, Jenna, I think a lot of people are exhausted,
Yes.
literally exhausted by
Yes.
how much rancor there is in the country, how uncomfortable, how gross you feel after you're in a social media exchange that goes in what is such a typical way in our polarized society. And just like you just kind of want to throw up your hands and say, I don't want to deal with
Yeah.
any of this. So I think people are hungry for community. And one of the things I really want to point out about that community in Pennsylvania that is a principle that can maybe give us all something to work towards and hope for. When things go bad, we retreat into the places where we feel safest. And if the only relationships where we feel really safe are among people who think and look like us, because those are the relationships we've built and invested in, then that's what we'll retreat into. Those people in Pennsylvania had done the work of actually building relationships and having had some difficult conversations, but also some heartwarming exchanges for months before that assassination attempt. So that when it happened, they didn't just retreat into their own, they retreated into each other. They felt like, I know somebody who I know is gonna vote differently from me in a couple months, but who I know cares about me and probably has some ideas on this that I'm kind of interested in, or who might listen to what I have to say on this because I want us to prevent violence in our community here in Pennsylvania, right? And so the empowering and safe and wonderful way that it feels when you have those relationships, when you feel trust, across dividing lines in your society, like you don't just have to retreat into your own, you can retreat into one another. And I know that sounds maybe a little bit Pollyannish, but that the examples you asked me to give, that team in Burundi, that in the midst of the genocide in Rwanda, that sparked similar violence in Burundi, mobilized the first interethnic media outlet across the whole Great Lakes region of Africa that was later credited with helping to prevent genocide. These Hutu and Tutsi journalists and radio producers who produced not just joint reporting teams, which were the only reporting teams that could really get at the truth, because only people from each ethnic group would talk to a reporter from their ethnic group at that time, but also produced things like the most popular soap opera in the show for 15 years, a radio soap opera about a Hutu and Tutsi family that lived side by side and had neighborly disputes and interethnic romances and teen rebellion that they had to deal with, and all this stuff that is also just human, and using that show to open up discussions across dividing lines. So there are a million. The good news is that there are a million different ways to go about this trust building, that people actually want it. The scariest part of it is before you've done anything. The scariest part of it is imagining, how the heck am I going to reach out to these people, or how would I start? Because you build up the other side to be this massive other. And it can be really, really rewarding. If you don't put such high stakes on this, if you're just connecting, asking questions, see if you can ask, for all of us, one assignment, if we're looking for an assignment, is see if you can find somebody across whatever dividing line is meaningful to you, a religious or political one or whatever, and see if you can have one conversation before your next broadcast, Jenna, where the goal of it is to see if there's anything you can find about that person that you respect. Full stop. Is there anything about them that you respect?
Oh my God, I'm actually going to burst into tears. I'm going to burst into tears, Shamil, because you asked a room full of people last week, please raise your hand if any of you have had a relationship in turmoil or ruined because of the events of the past 2 years, we'll call it. Forget the past 10. Everyone's hand shot up. And I have angst and sadness and heavy-heartedness about what has evolved with those relationships. And I have never paused to think about what it is that I love and still respect about those people.
Yeah. I think we've all gone through this, Jenna. Honestly, I feel for you. And I have this. Look, I'll be honest with you. One of the reasons I love my job is because I'm surrounded by people who do this better than I do it. I'm not kidding. I mean, all the example. I didn't give you a single example today of anything I did.
I know.
And that's not humility. That's just the reality. Like, I get to work with these people, and and they challenge me, and they inspire me, and they also inspire one another, and they boost each other's spirits. When the Taliban took over Afghanistan, the team there told us that they got their biggest inspiration and support from the team in Myanmar that had been dealing with the post-coup junta in Myanmar. And when the war, the October 7th attacks happened in Israel, and then the war in Gaza picked up immediately afterwards, our Israeli and Palestinian team said that they got the partners that we work with there got some of their greatest inspiration from talking to our director of our Afghanistan program, who's the only Afghan woman leading an international organization in Afghanistan today, and has really grown the program since the Taliban took over. Afghanistan and Israel, Palestine have nothing to do with one another. Afghanistan and Myanmar have little to do with one another. But we need to be there for one another to, boost our spirits when we're feeling down, and frankly, keep us level-headed, when we're getting a little full of ourselves. I'll just speak personally, and we can do that for one another. We really can. So, yeah.
No, I love the question that you posed to the chat. Like, are there actual things that you respect about that other person? No need to name names, but something that I would even appreciate people contributing what that might be, just because I know that I'm sure most humans have all of those things that you respect. And I think that's a beautiful common ground. Shamil's going to go in a minute, but I'm not going to let him leave until he answers this quick question about Ukraine, Russia, which is specifically one, I would love to know what search is doing in that region. But, what is the potential common ground between Russia, Ukraine, Russians, Ukrainians around a ceasefire peace, or where's the common ground in a moment like that?
Well, I don't mean to disappoint you, but we don't work there first, and I'm always very hesitant to speak with any kind of authority over places where we don't have teams on the ground that are really informing my opinions. I will just say that one of the things that's very striking about that conflict, that I don't think a lot of Americans necessarily appreciate, is is the degree to which, if you if you visit, and you probably have followers today from across Western Europe, the degree to which Europeans I speak with, Belgians, Swedes, certainly Poles, but others, are really, whether you think it's legitimate or not, doesn't matter. Really doesn't matter. They are quite convinced that a ground war with Russia is very likely in the next 5 years, and their governments are preparing for it, and their governments are telling them to prepare for it, as even as tactical as prepare go bags for the possibility, literally in some of the states. Um, and part of why I raise that is because, like a lot of conflicts today, that is a conflict where there are a lot of other powers also engaging and interjecting. And so you would like to see uh, some sort of a negotiation between the Russians and the Ukrainians directly. There are a lot of powers, at play, and there's a lot of history there. We don't have people on the ground. I think that, to me, the thing that's really devastating is this: if every one of your followers today, if everyone who's on this channel with us today, were to think about the most important issue for you, like the cause that matters the most to you, the cause that you would drop everything to mobilize on, or the thing maybe you've organized your life around it or whatever. If I had the power to suck the oxygen literally out of the room where you're sitting right now, that cause would immediately disappear in your mind and you would scramble for the exits. And
Right.
that is what happens when mass violence breaks out. All of the Ukrainians, and those Russians who have been touched by this violence directly in the communities in Western Russia, that is the reality of life right now. And so, we talk about violence. Violent conflict is not just one of multiple causes to mobilize around. It destroys progress on everything else, and it does it for a whole generation. If the war between Russia and Ukraine ends today, it's going to take 20 years to rebuild what can be rebuilt, let alone the things that will never be rebuilt and the lives that have been lost. But if there's any semblance of trust to be rebuilt between even regular Ukrainians and Russians, it'll take 20 years. 20 years without any interjection of mass violence happening again.
Right.
That's what
With
we're
no
seeing
hiccup.
now, in Gaza. So I don't have a good answer for you there, and I don't mean to leave you on like a down note. But we don't have teams there. I'm not an expert on Russia and Ukraine, but I know that it's absolutely have to, before anything else can be accomplished. You absolutely have to stop the killing. That's as simple as I can, as stupid and simple as I can put it. That's the reality.
And I can speak on behalf of Shamil that applies to every conflict in the world. Shamil, I know you are now going to be a few minutes late to your reservation. And so I want to thank you again for coming on and sharing your wisdom to communities that don't often have access to voices like yours. I believe this kind of space is a space we can continue to ideate, find that common ground, but also be intentionally curious, try to, in that American exceptionalism element, try to table that and see if we can embrace that humility that makes it much easier to be free, and to ultimately what I believe is get us more free. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me. I think my teenagers might think I'm cool now. Probably not, but It's a contribution to the effort. Thank you very much.
A work in progress. All right, Shamil, I'm going to let you go. And the way that you do that is you just hit that big red button. And I'm going to stay on in case anyone has any additional questions or wants to share any thoughts around, I don't know, specifically what it is that they respect about the other. Oh, gosh, it is always really intense to talk to Shamil because he comes in with the context of, I mean, so many genocides. But anyway, I really appreciate y'all being here. This is one of many conversations that we'll have in the peace building efforts, which feels so far out of reach given the headlines that exist today. I know I got 4 or 5 news alerts just in the past 40 minutes, and I'm anxious about seeing them, but would love to hear from all of you before we raid. Specifically, if there was anything that you were surprised about that he shared. I will actually add that there's 2 different bits that he did not talk about that that I think are important for us to consider, at least as an American, someone who has spent so much time in the foreign policy space and studying. I studied peace in grad school, which is really the study of war. But there was 2, his team broadly has described what's happening in the US as different than so many of the other conflicts that they work in worldwide, in that a lot of Americans aren't descendants of people who have been in war or generationally have heard the stories at the same graphic level that so many other, we'll call millennial Gen Zs, might be experiencing internationally. And that in international conflicts, so much of the money and attention and support for the conflict is also coming from international actors, whereas here in the US, all the money and the problem solvers are stateside, which again lacks a little bit of that international context of what has worked and hasn't worked, but also the consequences of war. And the one thing that like really lingers with me is that that a lot of the people who are in charge aren't necessarily immediate descendants of people who have experienced war, and so that idea of what hell actually looks like is not close enough for us to like double down and trying to avoid. We still see it from afar, even though it feels like it's getting closer. Anyway, y'all, thank you very much. We're going to raid now. We're going to raid to another channel, and we will see you back on soon. Jay, it's all yours. I don't know. Okay. Jay mentioned the Israel-Gaza conflict being its own set of conversations. It will be, in addition to Ukraine and Russia. Do politics. Master Liberty, you can't be that old. Okay. I don't know, Master Liberty. Who should we raid? Jay's trying to find someone. Oh, I should also mention that tomorrow we're going to be on with in advance of Trump's military parade on Saturday. And we're going to be talking about the No King's Day efforts and the psyche of people who are trying to be kings. I mean, don't make any assumptions about my royalty in my house. Yes, Master Liberty is also his birthday. I don't know. I don't know how we rebuild trust. I mean, I think that's such like an ethereal, existential thing. I don't think we've been raised to trust ourselves, let alone figure out how we trust other people. Particularly the systems. And, I'm so grateful that folks are actually here willing to engage and at least like lend an ear. But I have found so much freedom. I guess I've built trust within myself, trying to understand, trying to be like curious. Like if instead of me being like, I'm certain, like every single time I'm like, I'm sure, I'm like, oh, you're not though. Yeah, the world's more polarized than it's ever been. That's so frightening. It's true, Master Liberty. But I also think, like, going back to Shamil's point about you can have an issue that you care about, and then the second the oxygen is sucked out of the room, you don't care. You're just trying to get to the you're just trying to get out the exits. That like, I feel like back then when it was about like colonies not trusting each other, that it was still just like such a survival was the baseline. Whereas I feel like we still have the belief that we can go shopping for the best solution. Do you think you have an allegiance issue? I mean, like, I actually don't even know if I know what an allegiance issue is. Yes. Well, I think it's the conveniences that America has provided. I mean, the same reason why Shamil's parents came over here is because there was like this dream and the white picket fence and like everyone can have their own vacuum and mixers and great public school educations. And so there's this like allegiance to this, the myth of the story, without, in their defense, I think, really and fully appreciating the consequence of those kinds of commercialized decisions. It also propped it up an economy for many generations that was based on just consuming behaviors, and that's not sustainable, period, full stop. But it does, like, that allegiance to what it means, like this American way of life, that's what I meant when I was like, I just feel like everyone has road rage and everyone feels like they deserve to have the car that's in front of them move. Or like these like sense of conveniences. Like I've spent a lot of time thinking about the conveniences that I'm not willing to sacrifice. And as much as I cannot stand Bezos and Amazon and boxes, like there are some times when I'm like, I can't find her ballet shoes and she needs a new pair tomorrow, and like I have to order them on Amazon. And it's like, is this a convenience I'd really be willing to give up? And I also think that we like the convenience to be able to bitch. I totally second what KKKKK Kieran said. A relationship with a story that never really existed. It did for some. I don't know, Master Liberty. You tell me. Like, was the past that great when women couldn't open credit cards or get home mortgages until like what 30 years ago? Like, it was great for some people, like primarily like white men. It wasn't this idea of like what was good from the past. I don't know. Our national parks weren't in jeopardy. Holy shit, is that the only thing I can think of? And I also have this theory. Jay, you can read whenever you're ready. I also have this theory that I forgot what I was going to say. Yeah, I know, but here's my question about the dream, Master Liberty, is the dream actually like chasing the white picket fence? Because there's nothing really authentic about having a beautiful home or all the money in your pocket or having like people pawning after you or being able to to own that kind of power that I feel like is this currency that people are like desperately trying to grab at when you have no self-worth and you don't like hang out with yourself and you question whether or not you're good enough all of the time. Like, the American dream was based on these ideals of like things and power and control. And since none of that is authentic, none of it will survive. Like, we've all been in relationships where you're like, I like the person enough. Yeah. And you say, I love you, but like maybe you actually don't. If it's not authentic, if it's not real, if it's like not to the core of like your own humanness or humanity, it won't survive. And I believe that's what's crumbling down in the US, is that these stories, these like myths, these like games that these ways that we've been played, it's not that like people are calling bullshit on them. I'm sure that's happening, but like the thing is just crumbling down because it can't sustain the test of time because it was never authentic. Yeah, I think individualism and self-sufficiency is a myth. I think knowing oneself and loving oneself, and that's our hardest work. I'm a really confident person and I still question whether or not I'm worthy. My biggest challenge this life is to know that I'm deserving of my own love. But I do not think that we can exist in our individual and self-sufficient state. Okay, Jay, I'm tapped and I hear the kids coming upstairs and I think someone got stung by a bee. I'm fine. Okay. Bye, everyone. See you.